Hello, everybody. My name's Jim, and this is a character review for Going Under by Sonia Henry. If you are looking for a spoiler-free review of this, I did have one in my May wrap-up. I talked about this book a good few minutes, so if you want to see a review of this without any spoilers, definitely go check out that video first. This video is going to go over the entire plot, or at least what I can remember of it. So, again, if this is an interesting book for you, it is about the medical field, especially for newer doctors who are just entering it. Go check out the review there and click the Goodreads link in the description. Otherwise, I need to go ahead and say that there will be content warnings in this. I will talk about death, suicide, and abuse. I will let you know when the latter two are about to come up, but as it pertains to death, this is a book about doctors. So I don't really have plans to timestamp that, but I also don't plan to get graphic. So I will warn you when the latter two come up, because there is a huge plot point in this story where that sort of thing takes place. But outside of that, if anything I say ends up a bit too much, I will insert an audio cue just in case you are an audio listener and you're not actually watching the video, so that you know that it's time to skip over to a different part of this video. I do need to jump into the first character. Her full name is Katerina Holiday, but her friends and those who are closest to her call her Kitty. She's a new doctor fresh out of medical school, and this is more or less her story, learning the ropes. It was very clear in this novel that Kitty was a self-insert, even down to her physical description, because there was a part where she described herself in the mirror. It was very obvious. But it is important to say that the author of this novel is a doctor herself. The medical commentary was amazing, and I could tell that the author had experienced a lot of this. Of course, the sexy times were a bit embellished, and just like most of the characters in this story, Kitty does have her flaws. She had this tendency to immediately start crushing on some of the men that she came across. And after reading the blurb, I kind of expected there to be a love interest, but I didn't realize just how many could be possibilities in this book, if that makes sense. It was a little bit like Russian roulette, but in reverse. Like, you knew that Kitty was going to take the bullet, you just didn't know which guy was going to pull the trigger. But her main obsession was the one with Dr. Prince, who was the first person that she met in the hospital who wasn't one of her friends, who treated her with any sort of respect, treated her as an equal, and took her on. It was a healthy boss-employee relationship, romantic feelings aside. Their interactions as they were doing their rounds and were in surgery theater together, it felt really good. It felt natural. He was there to help. He was a mentor. He assisted when he needed to, and he treated her with respect and saw a lot of promise in her. But when Kitty's thoughts started going into a bit more of a romantic territory, I got a little bit worried because I enjoyed Dr. Prince. He was married, he was a superior, he had money, a life outside of the hospital, but most of all, I didn't want their interactions to become awkward in any way. I was fine with her fantasizing over him because, there is something about somebody being respectful to you. Of course, you want to hang out with the one person who likes you, but on the other hand, if you go too far and you start feeling some things over your boss, it might not end up too well. We're going to talk a little bit more about Dr. Prince in a little bit and how these romantic feelings wrapped up, but first I want to talk about Kitty's friends. One of the reasons why I rated this book so highly was because her friends also had their own side plots going on. I thought that was so smart of the author to include, and in a way, each of the friends represented one aspect of the medical field that doctors have to deal with all the time. In the beginning, all of the friends were pretty happy-go-lucky. Max and Estelle followed Kitty from medical school, and Winnie was more like an outside friend. She was outside the workplace, but she was a flatmate of Kitty's. I can't remember exactly where she met each of her friends. I feel like she knew Estelle the longest, but I'm not quite sure. But anyway, yeah, they got along. They had a great relationship, and they would all meet in the cafeteria and just kind of chat about their day in the beginning. It was really easy then. I mean, the stresses started to pop up in the beginning, but overall it was pretty laid back because nothing dramatic had happened yet. Estelle even made the comment. She mentioned that their lives were suddenly going to become episodes of 50 Shades of Grey's Anatomy. And I will say that this book is a bit more Grey's Anatomy and a little less 50 Shades of Grey, but there are a few shades, maybe like 20. I mean, they're there. But when things really started to happen, and I thought that this was going to be one of the more boring parts of the story, was when Kitty, Estelle, and Max, along with other interns and new doctors, were sent to a small town to help in a hospital that is severely understaffed. It was like a rotation. Some of the doctors would come in and out just to help out with some of these small town hospitals, since the Sydney hospital was more like a well-oiled machine. While we're in this small town, Kitty takes the role of the person who signs death certificates. She works in the morgue. She does tend to find a little bit of dark humor when it comes to actually confirming deaths, because she's like, what's going to happen? Am I going to check it off the list and then suddenly they're going to come back to life? I don't think so. But she does have to check their vitals and ultimately send them down to the morgue. So that is mostly her job in the small town. Max, I'm not sure exactly what he did in the small town except get in trouble, because he ended up being caught driving under the influence and going to jail, where another one of their friends that they met, I can't remember his real name, but I know that Kitty nicknamed him Godfather. He bailed Max out and was under the influence too. So these people are party animals. This group of friends tend to make really bad decisions, which is probably something that you don't want to know about a hospital. But the real drama happened with Estelle. So you're probably noticing the pole dancer in her icon. She was a stripper before she became a doctor. And I actually know someone who took that career path. This is a death trigger warning. Estelle's drama started when there was a child, a young boy. He might have even been an infant. He came into the hospital. He had a pre-existing condition. Something happened where he wasn't receiving oxygen. Estelle called and called and called the other doctors to help her in this situation, and none of them showed up. There was one guy who showed up, and he didn't know what to do either. So she kind of had to think on her feet, and she stuck a tube down his throat to help him breathe. This was something that she hadn't learned in school how to do. When the results of this came out, she found out that the boy passed away, and that the tube was actually stuck into his esophagus and not through his windpipe. So he was not getting any oxygen at all. She stuck it down the wrong tube, and she was devastated. This is what broke her, because throughout the book, not only are we following Kitty, but we are getting updates from Estelle about the subsequent lawsuit, the potential wrongful death suit that was looming over her head, and she was worried about losing her job, and it was just a really depressing situation. We didn't know too many of the details, but we did know enough to know Estelle's mental state and how she was deteriorating over the stress of that on top of the stress in the hospital. But this leads me into Winnie, who represented the outside perspective. She is the friend who doesn't necessarily know exactly what happens in the hospital, but she's the confidant of Estelle, Max, and Kitty, who takes all of their stress, listens to them vent, and basically takes on the aftermath of everything. And as somebody who has been in that position, it is really hard to constantly hear the negative come from somebody. It really bogs you down and it destroys your mood. So I could totally understand where Winnie's coming from. And she told us a story, suicide trigger warning. She told us a story of her mom and how her mom passed away because of cancer. There was this doctor who would come into the room and check on her mom, make sure that she was okay, and was just basically with her for the entire journey until Winnie's mom passed away. Winnie was in the hospital room with her mom when it finally happened, and the doctor came to visit both of them to make sure Winnie was as okay as she could be. But Winnie really appreciated this doctor and called the hospital just to check on him and thank him for being with her mom during those final days. Unfortunately, she found out that the doctor had committed suicide, and this shocked her. And listening to all of the stresses that Kitty, Estelle, and Max were going through and having to take that on, she couldn't help but have her mind go back to that situation with that other doctor who ended his life because of the stresses and possibly even the fact that he lost a patient that he was so attached to. She was worried for her friends that they would spiral down the same path and end up doing that too. Kitty assured Winnie that this wouldn't happen to her, but still there was Estelle in the case that she was going through, and there were times throughout the book that Kitty would recall the conversation with Winnie about the doctor that took care of her mom and was worried about Estelle's well-being. So throughout the novel with Estelle, Kitty would constantly check up on her whenever Estelle would need her to be in the room with her just for comfort, for somebody to talk to. Kitty would not hesitate, she would go. So that was a really good friendship. I really love healthy female friendships, and I think that this book certainly represented that very well. Winnie, Kitty, and Estelle were great together, and Winnie was honestly the best friend that anybody could ask for. I really like this group of friends. I love their dynamic, even though they didn't make the wisest decisions a lot of the time. They were still really fun to read and an interesting group to follow. As for the superiors, it was a little hit or miss. I already said that I really liked Dr. Prince, but Dr. David Hyde, who Kitty nicknamed Joker, was actually the first superior that we met. Going back to the whole Russian roulette thing, I thought that he was going to be the one that she would end up with, kind of like an enemies to lovers sort of relationship, but that's definitely not what happened, and I'm going to get into why Joker is one of the worst human beings in the literary world. Just to give you an idea, Kitty's first interaction with Joker was an angry phone call, first of all. But when she met him on the floor for the first time, he took her to his computer. He sat back in his chair with his hands behind his head and demanded that she scroll the scroll wheel on his mouse while he watched her do it. That was how much he respected the people who were underneath him. And throughout the story, he would constantly do these really awful things. He was a bully, essentially, but he wasn't just a bully to Kitty. There was a time where they were in a meeting with a lot of the interns, the newer doctors, and it was Joker, another superior named Dr. Richard Bird, but he was nicknamed the Shark by Kitty. He's not on this list because he didn't make too many appearances in the novel, but he was another one who was a bit tough. Like, he was a tough boss. He wasn't necessarily mean, but he was one that you didn't want to cross. And Dr. Prince was supposed to be there. Dr. Prince wasn't the type of person to make many appearances, apparently. According to everybody who worked at the hospital, he was a bit of a recluse. Like, he didn't show up much at all. So the fact that he would show up at all for Kitty was pretty interesting. But while they were in this assembly, Joker called out Dr. Prince for being late and being a no-show in front of everybody. And that is one of my pet peeves in person. I have seen this happen once, not in my current job, but in one of my previous jobs, where somebody stood in front of a bunch of us and we were at like an orientation, and the leader of the orientation, one of her colleagues, was answering questions in the back, and she called her out in front of everybody. And I thought that was such a rotten thing to do, to embarrass your colleagues in front of her subordinates. It just isn't a cool thing to do. And that immediately, I was like, okay, if Joker is going to be the one, then he's going to have to turn around really fast, because that is a major pet peeve. He's already ticked me off. Like, it's not even 25% into the book, and he already has like 10 strikes against him. So at this point, I'm thinking if it's going to be him, then I'm probably going to dislike the book. But again, luckily, it's not him. But as I said before, with Dr. Prince, despite the embarrassment, he had the plan to save the patient that they were talking about in the assembly. He did what he said he was going to do, and I think it turned out well because I didn't hear anything about, there being a death or anything like that. So it was a very risky surgery, but Dr. Prince kind of knew that if he did or if he didn't, he was kind of damned either way. He was going to lose his job if he didn't operate because they were going to file a complaint on him. But if he did and the patient ended up dying, then his job was on the line there too. So it was a really tricky situation, and he did come out on top. But like I said before, throughout the process, Dr. Prince believed in Kitty and knew that she was capable of doing so much more. So she recommended that she write a paper and travel to Lund, Sweden for an extended program to work with his close colleague and friend, Dr. Wolfgang Dietrich, who was a little bit of a ladies' man and actually had an affair with the HR rep, Nicole. So this was another guy who I was thinking, oh, okay, so maybe he's the one that she's going to go far with, if you catch my drift. I'm winking. You can't see it, but you know what I mean. She ended up traveling to Lund, Sweden to work under Dr. Dietrich and his partner Tomas. It was a pretty generic set of chapters. There was one part of the plot there where she did fly to meet up with her fling Fabien, who I'm going to talk about later. But before Kitty flew back to Sydney, she invited Dr. Dietrich and Tomas to a dinner party so that they could reconnect with Dr. Prince, to which they agreed, and subsequently so did Dr. Prince. Winnie, being the most amazing friend that Kitty has, helped Kitty set up the party. And I wasn't sure when she did it and she said that she would tag along if she would play wing woman or if she would be there to kind of keep Kitty under control because she knew about her feelings for Dr. Prince. Because Winnie, like I said, she's the confidant. She knows everything about everything. As the party's going on, Kitty did feel a little bit guilty about not inviting Nicole, who had that thing with Dr. Dietrich. But in my mind, I don't know. I can understand why the guilt is there, but it wasn't a fair, Dr. Dietrich is a married man, and I kind of had the feeling that that would be a really awkward situation to put them in because you don't want to be in the position, with alcohol involved. If they were to do something else, I would feel more guilty personally if they ended up doing something together and continued their affair. It just didn't sound like a good idea. But as the party wound down, the group started to disperse. As Dr. Prince was leaving, Kitty walked him out. Before he left, Kitty thanked him for coming, and they ended up staring into each other's eyes, and this is when the kiss happened. And I was like, dang it. I was hoping that it was just going to be a fantasy. Luckily, it never went beyond a kiss. I mean, I guess it could have been a lot worse, but that isn't a good thing to do when you have a wife. You don't act on your romantic impulses if you are married or you're in a relationship. You just don't do it because if any of this gets out, the rumors get spread and they end up blowing up, like, you're done for. She's gonna leave you, and with good reason, honestly. But they were under the influence of alcohol, which is not an excuse, and he ended up confessing his attraction to her. She ended up confessing her attraction to him as well. He told her that, she was such a distraction and that, he couldn't stop thinking about her and yada, 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 which I was just like, gag, stop. I liked you, Dr. Prince, please stop. But yeah, they kind of ended it there. And you end up finding out later that Dr. Prince was kicked in the butt by karma and had a heart attack. He did not die, but he was sent to the hospital. There was a moment later where she visited Dr. Prince in the hospital. They didn't really go far. They did have a conversation and they hugged each other, but this was just for closure, really, because Kitty was worried that she was the one who caused the heart attack, which everybody else told her that that wasn't the case, but still, she had that guilt. The hug is basically where they left it, and they didn't go any further than that. So I'm not going to talk about Nicole individually. She is kind of a superior, but also kind of not. She works for HR, but I am going to talk about her a good bit with Rachel. And this is a very important part of the story. This was the latter 1/3, but we do get to know Rachel earlier on in the story as well. I haven't talked at all about her for a reason, and because of this, I am going to go back to the characters that I have discussed when I talk about her story, so just bear with me. Try not to get confused. I'm going to try to keep everything coherent and organized, so bear with me if you've made it this far. But this is where everything goes crazy. Rachel started off as a bit standoffish and mean, despite her old colleagues saying that she was bubbly and friendly. One thing that's interesting to note is that early in the beginning, I believe it was Joker, of all people, of course, who said that there was always somebody who was around to bring you down. This is about workplace politics. You know, there's somebody always ready to step on you to get to the top, and they'll do whatever they have to do to get there. When Rachel, who was the registrar, was introduced, I was like, okay, this is going to represent that person who Kitty thought that she could have a relationship with, because there was a bit of commentary about females in the medical field and how they're treated and how they just need to form that camaraderie together to get through. There were some times, though, where Rachel would let her guard down and make a connection with Kitty. There were a couple of moments where she quoted Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, which was Kitty's favorite book. There were some times where they recited the literature together, and it was a really sweet moment when that happened. And they would talk to each other about France and knowing a little bit of French. So there was a bit of a congruency there where they just meshed. And it's just too bad that Rachel felt the need to treat Kitty so poorly and bully her. But you do find out a little bit later that Rachel ramped up this bully behavior around Joker. She seemed to do whatever she could to make him happy, so if he was bullying Kitty, then she would do it too. And this is where I get into the trigger warning for suicide and abuse. So if you want to skip over this, the rest of Rachel's story is going to be about this, so do skip to Fabien if you don't want to listen to this. But if you're going to stick around, this is where all of the crap happens in the story, at least in the third act, and you're going to learn a lot more about the characters in this section as well. Unfortunately, I had to entangle them in this trigger warning, but this is really where a lot of stuff starts to click and make sense, and why I wasn't able to talk about Rachel sooner than this. But going back to how Rachel seemed to be more of a bully around Joker. Joker had been threatening Rachel's job. He said that if she wouldn't perform certain favors, that he would not give her a positive recommendation, and that her whole career would be screwed. He is honestly the scum of the earth, and he is the worst character not the worst written character, but the worst character. If he were a real person, he would be bottom of the barrel of all the characters that I've read so far. He just feels that sort of power over his subordinates, that he feels like he can just dangle whatever he wants over them. So he's been threatening her this whole time, and you kind of understand why Rachel is the way she is. But the way that we find this out is that one night when Estelle was feeling especially low about the court case that was going on, she texted Kitty to come meet her in what was like a supply closet, I guess. I don't necessarily know if it was a supply closet, but that's what I'm going to say it was. It was a small space. Kitty, of course, being worried about Estelle's state of mind, got up out of bed. This was like a late night trip. She went to the hospital and she met up with Estelle in this closet to talk. While Estelle was going over her situation, over the court case, and giving us the details that we need to kind of keep up with her and keep up with her story, you hear, or you read, these bangs against the wall. And there's a little bit of humor in this because Estelle is worried about people overhearing them because she is discussing some sensitive matters as it relates to the case that she's a part of. So she's constantly having to tell Kitty, like, keep it down, just shut up. Like, don't don't draw attention to us with your reactions. Just let me talk about it, and you whisper. Throughout this conversation, you hear these bangs. And when the conversation's done, they leave the closet, but Kitty leaves her keys behind. She goes back to the closet to fetch them, and then you see what was causing the bangs. And it's at this point where Kitty catches Rachel performing one of those acts on Joker. Rachel catches Kitty, Joker doesn't, but Rachel comes out, catches Kitty, and basically threatens her and says, like, if you tell anybody, then your job's going to be ruined. So Kitty goes home to her flat. She talks to Winnie about it, and Winnie is the only person who knows. And this is important because she tells Winnie because she's worried, first of all, about what Rachel might do if word gets out. And because, Winnie doesn't work at the hospital, she is the safest person to tell. But it's important to know that Max had just walked out of the room before Kitty told Winnie. So keep that in the back of your mind. Winnie, again, being the best friend that she is, she told Kitty, you need to go to HR about this situation and get Joker out of there, get him fired. But again, there was this worry that Rachel was going to follow through on her promise to ruin Kitty's career, and it wasn't going to turn out well for her. I don't know necessarily what I would have done in that situation. I would have assumed that people would have understood Rachel's situation. I would have hoped so anyway, because if you have your whole life hanging in the balance and somebody is evil enough to dangle that over your head, then I have nothing but sympathy for you. I understand that what you're doing is inappropriate, like you're in the hospital, you're performing these acts and you're doing this, but I also understand the amount of threat that is being thrust against you and that you have your back against the wall. I would not hold this against Rachel at all. And as a reader, I didn't hold it against her either. I actually felt really bad for her. But we're going to get to Nicole in a minute and why I don't think that she thinks the same way. As we fast forward through the story, we do learn from the character named Godfather that there was a registrar who OD'd on medication and was sent to the hospital. At this point, Rachel and registrar are pretty synonymous because she's the only registrar that we really got to know. So it was weird to me that there was no point in that conversation from Kitty learning that a registrar OD'd to finding out that it was actually Rachel, that it never crossed her mind that it could be. It wasn't a surprise to me when it turned out being Rachel. When I saw the word registrar, it just immediately clicked. So yeah, that was a little bit odd. But yeah, so Rachel did OD on medication and was sent to the hospital where she was taken care of. And Kitty, of course, was wrought with guilt, going back and forth about not telling HR and trusting Winnie. And she even went to Winnie and she said, I should have listened to you. I should have done what you said. And, again, Winnie being a good friend, she talked her down and was like, you did what you felt you needed to do in that situation because your job was being threatened too. But we do find out later that Rachel is moved from her hospital room to the psychiatric floor where she's taken care of there. But she is somehow able to convince the doctors there that she is mentally capable enough to be discharged early, to which we find out she runs into traffic and is hit by a large vehicle. And that is unfortunately where she dies. This, of course, hits the group of friends very hard. And Nicole, who is the HR representative, makes her rounds to all of Rachel's coworkers to make sure that they're okay and they are able to get through the best they can. So Nicole ends up going to Kitty's flat to talk to her. I believe Winnie's there at the time, but she leaves to give them a moment of peace. And this is where Kitty finally opens up and tells her exactly what happened between Rachel and Joker. But also, she ends up talking about the party because Nicole brings down Kitty's walls and, Kitty's able to treat Nicole like a friend because Nicole is there to comfort and take care of her at the time. So she does talk about her party with Dr. Dietrich and Dr. Prince and how she felt bad about not inviting Nicole to that. And, they had a good conversation, but of course, Kitty ends up telling Nicole about the kiss as well. When Kitty returns to the hospital, she is called once again by Joker, who is completely unfazed by Rachel's death because of course he is, because he's a prick. Kitty ends up confronting him full on, letting him know what a miserable piece of crap he is. And he, again, is unfazed. He smirks, he laughs a little bit, and he tells her, you can't touch me. He knows about the kiss between her and Dr. Prince, and he is once again going to dangle that above Dr. Prince's head. He probably knows that Kitty isn't going to be in as much trouble as Prince because Prince is a superior, and this sort of thing is not only very looked down on, but I don't think that Dr. Prince has the respect of everybody in the hospital just because he is a bit of a no-show a lot of the time. But this could also ruin Dr. Prince's life and ruin his marriage. He's already had a heart attack, so he's not in the best physical condition to take this sort of blow. And this angers Kitty even more, of course, but she can't do anything about it because she's not only worried about her job in this situation, but she's worried about Dr. Prince's job, his health, and his life. However, not long after that interaction, Kitty is called to a meeting with one of the executive doctors. Is that even a thing? An executive? I don't know. I don't know how the hospital works, but she is at the top of the top, and she has called this meeting. That includes Kitty, it includes Nicole, it includes Joker, and Kitty is wondering, what's going on here? Why am I here? She thought that it was going to be about her and Dr. Prince, so she expected Dr. Prince to be there, but he does not show up. Instead, Max shows up. To Kitty's surprise, it turns out that Max has a very small bladder. And the night that Kitty and Estelle were talking in the supply closet, he had to pee. And he happened to have to pee in the men's changing room where Joker and Rachel were. He overheard them. He is the one who was ultimately wrought with so much guilt that he went to his superior and he explained the situation and what had happened. Because Kitty was there, she was able to corroborate everything, and this infuriated Joker. And by the way, I understand that there is a tinge of convenience here, but I wanted Joker to go down at this point. I don't care if it is a convenience. I'm happy that Max was there, just happened to be there, just happened to need to pee, and happened to know all of this information and was the one that gave it away because Joker needed to go down. Was very happy to see him upset and fumbling and stumbling over his words, and it was just glorious. And I love Max. I love him. He is the gay best friend without being a trope. He actually had a life, a personality, and he ended up saving the day. So go Max, love you, great representation. Anyway, moving on. Kitty didn't know why she was there at that time because Max had no idea that she was even in the supply closet when all of this was going on. But it turns out that before Rachel died, she wrote a note specifically for Kitty explaining her situation and what had been going on. The others left the room just to give Kitty some space to read, and as she was going through, she saw all of these pressures that were going on in Rachel's life, how Joker was threatening her career, how all of this stuff just kind of stacked on each other and kept weighing her down mentally, and how nobody seemed to care about it, and how her personality had changed since becoming a registrar working under Joker, and how she missed her life, and how she was jealous of Kitty and her friends for being so happy and being able to hang out and have a good time. Because there was one point where Kitty and her friends were at a bar and Rachel happened to see them. She wasn't visible in the scene. Kitty didn't realize that she was there, but Rachel didn't want to disturb them because she saw how happy she was, and she wanted that. She was missing that in her life because she knew that she was that once and it was gone now. So it kind of explains how Rachel's colleagues from before thought of her as this really peppy, perky, happy person, and how all of that changed once she started working under Joker. But she listed all this out, and when I tell you that I was ugly crying, I was ugly crying. This is not an easy thing to read, even if she is a fictional character. It was very hard. It's just one of those situations where you just wish that you could rewind time, knowing what you know, and just being there for that person before, things happen and before things get to that point. It's just difficult. It's so hard. And I couldn't help but feel for Rachel. Throughout this book, she was called the Smiling Assassin. She was given a nickname because she was such a jerk throughout the entire book to Kitty. But I never really liked that nickname. I always much preferred Rachel because not only was it easier to say, but there was a little spark in Rachel that I saw, especially when they would communicate and talk about Through the Looking Glass and talk about France. There were parts of Rachel where I thought that this would become an enemies to friends sort of situation, but I had no idea that it would turn out to be this way. But I also think it's important to talk about Max in this situation because I haven't really talked about him much either. There was a time in this book, especially after the night in the closet between Estelle and Kitty, that Max was around without being around. He would be in his bedroom sleeping, or you would find out later that he would be so stressed that he would just go live with his mom for a little bit so that he didn't have to worry about some of the extra stuff that goes on. There was that little bit of a plot point there that he was just kind of absent. I thought it was just kind of like an Estelle situation where he would come back again. There would be a situation where he was very important to the plot and that he would have a big story to tell. Boy, was I right. I had no idea that this was going to be it, but this was it. I just knew that his absence was suspicious. I just had no idea. And of course, he beat himself up too over not going to HR sooner or not talking about it with Kitty because they both felt like if they would have come together that this whole situation could have been avoided, but still it was just so difficult to deal with and difficult to read that letter. But that was Rachel's story. And you find out afterwards because Nicole, of course, runs after Kitty to explain her situation as if we care. But she said that she was just so jealous that Kitty was able to spend time with Dr. Dietrich that she ended up blabbing to Joker about the situation. Nicole needs to be fired too because that is not HR's job to blab around. Everybody else got a nickname. Can we give her one too? What she did was detestable and certainly something that an HR representative should not do ever. That made me dislike Nicole a lot. For somebody who really didn't show up in the book very much, other than to tell the group of friends that, such and such a guy talked to her that day and she thought that he was flirting with her, she does not need to work at that hospital anymore either. Of course, she's not at the level of Joker. Joker's scum of the earth. He is the gum stuck to the bottom of my shoe. But she is annoying as well, and she just needs to be fired too. So it's really hard to follow this and in this video on a light note, but I am going to talk about Fabien a little bit as Kitty's fling from Europe. He pops up here and there in conversation and in her internal thoughts. Fabien is Kitty's second major flaw, or at least how she treats him is her second major flaw. So I mentioned briefly that while she was in Lund, Sweden, she booked a hotel room so that they could hang out for a few days before she flew back to Sydney. While she was in the hotel room, she got a FaceTime from him while he was in the airport. So he had already committed, he had paid for his ticket, and he was in the airport, and he FaceTimed her and said, "Hey, my flight has been delayed," or "My flight's been canceled." Either way, he missed his flight, and he told her that he was going to take the next one. Apparently, she believed that he was so flighty that he wasn't telling the truth, even though he was FaceTiming, again, from the airport. For me, personally, I would not spend that money on a plane ticket. Plane tickets are pretty expensive. Even for very short domestic trips, plane tickets are not cheap. Or at least not cheap enough for me to flake out on. So he was in the airport, and she was like, he's non-committal, he's not going to show up. So she ends up making this rash decision to leave the hotel, go back to Lund to finish her job with Dr. Dietrich and Tomas. She ends up getting a FaceTime later from Fabien from the hotel room asking where she is. he was like, I thought I would surprise you, and show up a little bit earlier than you expected. And of course, she was embarrassed, and she explained the situation to him, which he took so well. He laughed it off, and he was like, "Oh, we're gonna make the best of this. I have some alcohol here, and you and I are gonna have a date over FaceTime, and it's gonna be really nice." So they ended up talking all night, and there was one point where she said something about having to fly back to Sydney because he wanted to see her while she was in Europe, because of course he did. And she said that there wasn't enough time and that she had to fly back to Sydney. And he said, "Okay, well then maybe I'll surprise you one day in Sydney. I'll fly there." And the very first thing that she thought after he said that was that she didn't believe him, that she didn't believe that he would. And I'm sitting there like, he literally just did. He literally just flew to I think it was Amsterdam. He literally just flew to Amsterdam so that he could spend time with you in the hotel. And you were the one who flaked, left the hotel, and stood him up. And he took it so well and has been this really friendly guy. And you're just like, nah, he's not going to surprise me. That ticked me off. I'm like, why are you wasting this guy? Why are you treating him like this? So when Kitty went home, there were a couple of chapters where she met up with this doctor named Lucas, who wasn't even important enough to make this list, but he was important enough to tick me off too. She ended up going the furthest with this guy named Lucas, who she knew in medical school. I think he was a professor, maybe. He is the one that she ends up getting naked for, and they don't really go all the way, but they get really close. And the reason that she likes Lucas so much and she falls head over heels with him so fast, like literally 2 chapters. I understand that she knew him prior, but it just seemed to come out of nowhere because she was obsessed with Dr. Prince this whole time. This was after Dr. Prince had his heart attack and was in the hospital. So she immediately just dumped Dr. Prince and was on to this guy. These 2 chapters just didn't need to happen. This character did not need to exist. These 2 chapters really, if the medical commentary was not as good as it was, and if I didn't enjoy her friends as much as I did, this book's star rating would have dropped for me just because of these 2 chapters. After the hug with Dr. Prince, I felt like Kitty would have learned her lesson and would have just stuck it out for Fabien. Luckily, they didn't go all the way because she did, I believe, think about Fabien in the moment and called it off. Like she said, this is inappropriate. We shouldn't do that, which Lucas respected, even though he was disappointed. But eventually, as far as Fabien's concerned, he does end up flying to Australia because, surprise, he does actually care about Kitty and her feelings, even though she doesn't think he does. He flies to Australia, but she ends up immediately knocking his money situation, saying that, you're not going to be able to be a ski instructor while I'm working my butt off at the hospital. So it just made me think, like, if you don't trust the man to follow through, if you don't trust him to commit, and if you nag about him about his money situation, because he is a ski instructor and I guess he doesn't make that much, and she is constantly talking about how doctors and nurses don't make very much either, I'm sitting here like, okay, so what's the draw then? He's hot, I get that, but he seems like a really decent guy, and you just constantly bring him down. Even when he does finally surprise you in Australia, you have something negative to say about him. Of course, being the man that he is, he just laughs it off and he's like, we'll work it out. Like, I don't think she deserves him. if that makes, I think that he needs to maybe find somebody else, because for somebody who has a money situation that she feels the need to bring down at every turn, to fly from Europe to Australia, to spend that much money on a plane ticket to see the woman that he loves, like, that's a big deal. I would be a lot happier to see him and would do a little bit less knocking, and maybe save those sorts of conversations for, a few months down the line if he decides that he wants to stay with you. And what's funny is that Kitty is one of the characters that I didn't like as much, which is hilarious because, again, she is a self-insert, but I did love her friends. I love Dr. Prince, except for the kiss, but, karma kicked his butt there. And I really felt for Rachel at the end. I think that Sonia Henry did do a really good job of crafting these side plots, these side stories for these side characters that a lot of times we don't really get in other books. And the medical commentary was so well done that this did end up being a 5-star read for me. But just going back to the Rachel situation and the focus on the suicide rate for medical staff, it is true. It is awfully high. And if there's anyone out there who feels these intrusive thoughts, whether you work in the medical field or not, please do contact the Lifeline in your country. I have a link in the description of the list that YouTube provides. I know it's really difficult sometimes to take that step, but please, if you need to, take that step. As for this book, if you want to read it yourself, check out the Goodreads link in the description, click on the retailer of your choice and purchase it from there, or borrow it from your local library either in person or through a library app if it's available. Otherwise, I've been Jim, you've been great, happy reading.